Welcome to the interview portion of this web series. Today we're going to talk tech with Anand. Anand, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So let's jump into it. Before we kind of go into tech specifically, let's talk a little bit about your background.
Sure, yeah. So prior to coming to Emory, I had 4 years of experience at Johnson & Johnson. I worked in supply chain management for the most part. So it was dealing with everything you see at Walmart, for example, Neutrogena face wash, Aveeno moisturizer, things like that. So making sure it was available in Walmart. And then also on the back end, working on the raw material side of things to actually make the product. I then came to Emory, and then I ended up working at Google after I graduated.
Awesome. What about tech was kind of appealing to you?
Yeah, honestly, so going into business school, I wasn't hell-bent on going into the tech industry. I made a list of companies that I wanted to work for after I graduated, based on industry and based on the function that I wanted to be a part of. So for me, I knew that it was one area which allows you, the tech industry allows you to move internally a lot. So you can be doing program management for 2 years, and you can hop over to product management. So it gives you a lot of flexibility in that sense, which drew me to it.
Awesome. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the industry. So can you give me kind of a high-level introduction to tech? And I know that's difficult because tech encompasses a lot, but if you could try to break that down for us.
Yeah, so I think the tech industry, especially for somebody outside of it, seems very, huge and very kind of technical heavy. But now being a part of it, I don't think that's entirely the case. I don't think you need to be technically brilliant to be a part of the industry. The industry has, all different business functions, from marketing to sales to every single business function that's possible. So just from a scale perspective, it's huge, but you really need to, they really look for functional expertise when you're trying to get into the industry. So that was my experience, at least when I was recruiting for the industry.
A little bit about your experience actually industry. What was that like?
Yeah, so I was an intern at Google last summer. So I was a program manager within the technical infrastructure division, which is a fancy way of saying I worked on data centers and the operations within data centers. So I came from a supply chain background. So some of my projects dealt heavily with supply chain concepts. So you're thinking about sourcing strategy, you're thinking about supply management risk, things of that nature, but it was also intertwined with being a project manager and leading a project from beginning to end. So that's what, in terms of a work specific experience, that's what it encompassed. And then obviously, Google had its own summer internship program, a lot of activities and a lot of just onboarding things that I was a part of. So I had a great summer overall.
Awesome. That's really good to hear. And so, because tech is so broad, in terms of some of our fellow classmates, was their experience similar, or can you talk a little bit about what other experiences within tech might look like, just to give more perspective?
Yeah, so I think in my year, we had 4 people go to Google, and I think we had a couple of other Amazon interns, if I'm not mistaken. But at Google, I can speak to those experiences. So I think, honestly, we had one person in sales, another person in partnerships, people operation partnerships, which is basically taking care of everybody who works at Google, and another one working on Google Cloud in terms of a consulting experience. So it was pretty broad across, what Google does. I think in terms of experience-wise, I did hear that, there was more direction, especially for me. I felt like I got great direction from my manager. I felt like some people might not have had that direction, but it was always, a task given to them or a project given to them, and they had full ownership about it. So I felt like that was a huge experience to have, only because you really understand the ins and outs of what the team that you're a part of does on a daily basis.
Absolutely. That's awesome. So, if people are interested in actually, pursuing tech, let's talk a little bit about actually breaking in. So, I know your preparation was a little bit different. I think it's actually worth talking about that you did multiple industries because that's something that's a lot of people think about and beneficial to think about. So let's talk about your preparation for recruiting at kind of a basic level, and then we'll dive into a little bit more specifics about preparing for Google.
Yeah, so yeah, absolutely. So I came into business school, like I mentioned, not really. I knew what I wanted to do in a sense, but not. I wasn't hell bent on getting into one industry,
Yeah.
one position. So I recruited for consulting. I recruited for investment banking for a couple of weeks. I was interested in some leadership development programs. So I won't talk about investment banking because I didn't really focus on it too hard, but I did focus on consulting. So I did the whole, networking and case practice and things like that. For the leadership development programs, also it was networking heavy, but you just have to make sure that you're really applying for the position that you're tweaking your resume for the position that you're applying. And then even the other more functional jobs that I applied for, I always made sure that I knew exactly what the company was looking for in a candidate and tried to mold myself to meet those requirements. So that was my experience recruiting overall. And then if we can delve into the tech side of things.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the timelines of how you were able to do multiple things, because I think that
Sure.
is kind of an interesting aspect.
Yeah, so consulting was, first semester heavy. I kind of focused on consulting for the most part during the fall semester when we come into business school. I applied for tech jobs, maybe say in October of first semester, and I didn't hear back from them until March of the winter semester. So my first, focus was on landing a consulting job. From the opportunities that I got, I felt like I still wanted to recruit for a couple of more companies just to see if I could get a better offer. And that's kind of how I played with the timeline a little bit. I didn't focus too much on tech during the fall semester. I focused primarily on consulting and on some leadership development program on positions. But the majority of my winter semester was focused on kind of finding opportunities outside of consulting.
Yeah, I think that's important to note is that out of everything you might recruit for, tech actually probably lends itself best to doing kind of industry recruiting, because the timeline is you apply and then second semester for at least for a bunch of companies, it's not for every company you might actually find out. So
Yeah.
I actually considered doing tech as well, just because that was an area I was super interested in.
Right. Yeah, and I think, and I was slightly in a unique case because, Google got back to me in March of the second semester, whereas I think for other people, they got back to them sooner than that, which was beneficial for them.
Yeah.
Because they didn't have to wait that long to hear back from them.
Yeah.
But eventually and we might talk about timelines down the road as well, but tech doesn't have a strict timeline. So you might hear, if you apply in October, you might hear back in December, or in my case, you might hear back in March, whereas consulting obviously has a more structured timeline to it.
Yeah. And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but most tech recruiting happens kind of more off campus or just not school facilitated. Is that correct?
Yeah. So, yeah, that's right. I heard last year, in my second year, so not during when I was looking for internships, but I did hear that they had office hours through the CMC on campus, but I think the jobs themselves were still posted off campus.
Okay, cool.
And there's obviously, other diversity conferences, which actually they recruit heavily from. So your National Black, and I'm blanking on the other conferences right now, but they recruit heavily out of those conferences as well. So, I would recommend, if you know that, you are going to one of those conferences, to make sure you kind of network with them there and hopefully get an interview out of that avenue as well.
So just a little bit more about that. So in terms of off campus, besides the conferences, which are obviously going to be a little bit different this year just because of what's going on. How else were you able to kind of find out how to prepare or how to start applying to these different tech firms?
Yeah, honestly, I just made a list of tech companies that I would like to work at.
Mm-hmm.
It was mostly self-research.
Okay.
You look at the openings. I mean, once you signify or indicate that you're an MBA student,
Mm-hmm.
most of these tech companies send you a survey saying, these are the roles available
Okay.
for MBAs,
Cool.
and then you kind of rank them in order of what you would like to work on. There wasn't too much. Honestly, there was no networking on my end, at least for
Okay.
Google or Amazon or any other company. I think the industry itself is not too networking heavy. They look at functional expertise and whether you fit the role that they're looking for. So it's pretty simple.
Yeah, I think that was going to be my next thing is how does the networking work? And I think that's very different than consulting, where the consultants are all going to try to figure out who you are and a lot about you so that when your resume is dropped, they can look at it. But tech seems to be much more like structurally looking for certain, characteristics maybe that they want to pull out in an interview.
Yeah, no, and honestly, even networking, I've heard this from when I was an intern. Like, I just asked about networking, and they said, we get so many messages from so many people on LinkedIn that it's not even if they want to network and want to
Yeah.
help people, it's kind of not it's not feasible for them to put in that much time into helping people who they might not know. Right now, there's a referral system that happens at schools and stuff, which I'm not too at companies, which I'm not too knowledgeable about. But just networking in general is not a big part of why you get an interview.
Yeah. So if networking isn't a huge source or a huge way for you to kind of gather information, how did you find out what you should be doing to prepare?
Yeah, so I relied on alumni. I reached out to them, and they obviously were very responsive in getting back to me. I honestly relied on family connections too. Like, if I knew somebody had interviewed or works at the company, I kind of went through them. That was my approach to it. I'd say, other than that, and I didn't do too much of that either. I would say just looking up online to see even LinkedIn profiles of people to see what they did before, and see what they do now, and see if there's any overlap with your own experience. I think that was one way to learn about what the company wants. And then finally, I just tried to look at job descriptions online. Honestly, tailored my resume in a certain way that met those job descriptions. Not, I mean, you have to have once you get the interview, they'll know whether you're a good fit or not. But you need to see how you can kind of whether you're a good fit for the position you're applying for or not.
Mm-hmm. So just to kind of ask a follow-up question, do you think having some sort of background in what you might be doing post-tech, or at least some sort of logical experience might be beneficial?
Yeah, absolutely. I think they look at, I think the number one thing, especially pre-interview, so when they're looking to give somebody an interview, they're going to look for functional expertise. So like I said, during my internship, I worked on, it wasn't 100% supply chain, but it was some level, it was a mix of managing projects versus supply chain expertise. So I would say it's very hard to break into, like for me, it would have been very hard to break into marketing or sales or something like that without me having worked in that function before. Now, for product management, sometimes you can be a software engineer in your prior career, and then you can maybe apply to be a product manager. But it's few and far between that they don't look at functional expertise very heavily.
Cool. And I had kind of talked previously in some of the introductory episodes about how important having a compelling story is and really making that link. And I think for tech in particular, that is even more important, because if you don't have perfect background expertise for the role, you really need to be able to showcase that in a way that can get you in the door. And for particularly that industry, I think that's really important because they are looking for specific things.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think and in a way, because I worked at Johnson and Johnson in their CPG division, it kind of worked well for me in terms of what the company was looking for, because at Google, they're still trying to build that supply chain
Mhm.
from ground up. So they're not, a 100-year-old company which has established processes. They're still going through it. So they're looking for people who can provide value and add to what they have going on there.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So let's just briefly talk about the interview and potentially preparation. And I don't know if this is 100% accurate for tech, but I've basically said most interviews are broken down to a behavioral component and a technical component, whatever that looks like. I'm assuming that's somewhat accurate for what you went through. If you can kind of talk about that a little bit more and maybe kind of broadly the preparation you did for that.
Yeah. So yeah, you're absolutely right. So they look for, your behavioral fit in terms of, your personality or whether you're a team player and things of that nature. But they, like I mentioned, also look for your functional expertise.
Mhm.
Within the tech industry, they also have, each company has its, I guess, principles, right? Or some sort of um, list of qualities that they look for in a candidate. So when preparing for those interviews, you really have to drill down into each principle of a particular company and be ready to express yourself through those principles. So that was something that I didn't know as much about it for Google as when I interviewed, but it was really about focusing and making sure your answers are, succinct and concrete and really answering the question that's being asked. I think that was the biggest thing in my interviews. Um, and yeah, preparing for them, I went over my star stories again. They really drill down into each story that you start off with. So make sure you have, solid details about each one. That was my overall, that was, I think, my takeaway was that they're really looking uh, for you to explain each bullet point on your resume to the T and make sure that it's relevant to the question being asked.
And from what I gather, the companies are pretty transparent about the kind of core, ideals that they want you to talk about. Is
Yeah.
that true?
Yeah, that is
Okay.
absolutely. So, you once you've done your research and gone through the principles and everything, you know what they're going to ask you. Not exactly the question
Yeah.
going to ask you, but the principle that they're going to allude to when they ask you the question, or the direction that they're coming from in general.
Mhm.
So they're pretty, like you said, pretty transparent, and nobody's trying to trick you
Yeah.
in the interview or anything. They're pretty straightforward when it comes to that.
And was there a technical component or what did that look like? And I knew just depending on the role, that's actually very
Yeah.
broad.
Yeah, so for me, I mean, my technical interview was more supply chain and ops
Mhm.
related. It wasn't, coding or anything like that. But they do ask, they did ask me if I knew SQL,
Mhm.
which I did, but not to the extent that I do now, having worked there for a little bit. And especially on the job, you do have to have some level of, coding knowledge, not for all jobs, but in my job, at least I needed some basic knowledge of SQL and, querying stuff and things like that. They're not going to ask you for it unless you are interviewing for a product manager position.
Mhm.
But yeah, that's the extent to which my interviews were technical.
Awesome, cool. So before we go, one thing I'd like to do is kind of get any closing thoughts you have for the incoming MBA class. It can be anything, even beyond, recruiting and what we've talked about today.
Yeah, no. So I think from a recruiting standpoint, especially when you're applying to these tech companies, and I at one point I changed from being a little more lazy to being a little more proactive. Was that I changed my resume quite frequently to make sure that I came across as a good candidate for the position I was applying to. So at times, it does get a little frustrating to do that for maybe every couple of companies or every company. But I'd say that that was my big takeaway from recruiting itself, is that
Mhm.
you sort of have to change your approach to each company, and that worked for me. It might not work for everyone, but I think that was my way of doing things. And outside of recruiting, yeah, I think obviously finding a job is a big, one of the big reasons people come to school. But then
Yeah.
there's also a whole, a different side of the MBA that you should really aim to experience as well. So whether it's like, I don't know, being a leader on a club, or, focusing on academics, or like you're doing, Scott, like just giving back to the school. So I think there are a lot of things that you can get involved with. And I know recruiting and finding a job, especially now, is probably more stressful than it was when we went to school. But I think just having a holistic experience and coming out of the MBA with, more than just a good job is valuable as well.
Awesome. Well, that completes our episode about tech with Anand. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate it.